Hello and welcome to The Breakdown, your short, sweet, and digestible guide to public policy issues facing the country today. I'm your host, Brian Phillips with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. For more information on today's topic and just about any issue that you might read or tweet or post or hear about, just check us out online at texaspolicy.com. Today on The Breakdown, we're going to break down an issue that is unfortunately spreading all across the country, and that is homelessness. Here to break it down for us is Michele Steeb. Michele is a senior fellow with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and she oversees the foundation's initiative to transform homelessness policy, both here in Texas and across the country. Welcome, Michele.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really looking forward to our discussion.
Absolutely. Well, this is one of the things that has unfortunately increasingly more and more ended up on our front pages. It's ended up in our news reports, both at the local and at the national level. And we've all seen the horror pictures, really, just going across the country. Is this as bad as you've ever seen it since you've been looking at this issue?
Absolutely. It is so bad that there are places throughout the country where the numbers of people dying on the streets, the numbers of homeless people, are increasing by in the thousands of percent. Mm-hmm. It is a very, very serious issue, despite the promise that it would be fixed back in 2013.
Right, and we're gonna get into all those kinds of issues, particularly just the explosion and kind of what we like to talk about here is what is the public policy behind some of the reasons why it ended up this way. Right, it didn't have to end up this way. But first, I like to get kind of a sense of this isn't something people just jump into and say I want to study homelessness. What got you into this kind of work?
In 2006, I was loaned by the organization for which I work, the California Chamber of Commerce, to a small homeless shelter for women and children to fix their problems. They were literally on the brink of closing their doors, and I was loaned to them for a month. I fell in love after one day of being there and never left. Spent 13 years taking that emergency shelter program for women and children and building it into an 18-month program that actually helped them change their lives.
Now, what do you mean you fell in love? You with the purpose and the meaningfulness of the work, or what specifically drew you to it?
The meaning of the work, the purpose, and the women and children. At St. John's at that point, there was 100 women and children. I got to know them all very well because my office was right in the middle of the shelter, and I just fell in love with this opportunity. Mm-hmm. I had to help people really turn their lives around and have all those relationships still today. I'm still in touch with, thousands of women and children whom I've met over the years and whom I feel very fortunate to have been able to serve.
And now Michele has written extensively on this, tons of op-eds and done a bunch of media hits on this, particularly in the last year or so. I mean, right here in Texas, I'm in Austin, and we have seen over the last 2 years just this debate explode after the city of Austin decided that it was going to, in its infinite wisdom, end what's called the camping ban, which essentially allows individuals to sleep basically anywhere. There are some limitations technically, but having seen it firsthand here in Austin, essentially allowed anybody to take over public parks or public transportation. Whereas before you would have law enforcement come by and wake people up, and they couldn't necessarily be on the main streets and that kind of thing. But then there was just this explosion. I mean, literally, Michele, it felt like, I live downtown, and it felt like overnight, in the span of a couple of months, where we didn't see folks, laying in public parks. All of a sudden there's tents and camps and all of that everywhere. Has that been the general experience? Is that specific to Austin, or has that been the general experience with places that are having big issues with homelessness in other cities like San Francisco and LA?
Well, it's certainly not unique to Austin, though Austin is a very unique situation in Texas. It has, in between 2013 and 2020, the unsheltered, I'm sorry, between 2016 and 2020, the unsheltered population in Austin rose by 93%. That is
Hmm.
a staggering number.
Hmm.
But we're seeing those kinds of increases, throughout cities in California. We're seeing them in New York. We're seeing them in Chicago. We're seeing them in the Pacific Northwest, and in places like Florida as well, but largely places where there is no longer a balance of power, quite frankly.
And I haven't seen the research on this, but and usually when people are angry about these new policies, that other people blame as for the as the reason for the explosion. I mean, is it true that when these policies change, that it attracts people to the cities? I, I could see people just kind of making up, oh well, Austin's a homeless friendly place, and so a bunch of people are going to get on a bus and come from LA or San Francisco or Chicago down to Austin to be homeless. I mean, is that real? Does that actually happen, or what is the real phenomena there?
Well, the HUD data, and HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, is the largest national funder of homelessness, and thus they drive a lot of homelessness policy, including at the local levels, through which they distribute the majority of their funding for homelessness. Uh, Accordingly, they require these local communities to do counts. And according to the counts, it varies region by region, but they would say, maybe between 10 and 20% tops in a community that's really struggling with homelessness come from outside the community.
Mm-hmm.
That The HUD data, however, and we argue this in the paper we're about to discuss, uh, very, very significantly undercounts, we believe, that issue, but also the issue of what underlies homelessness. And in fact, I just watched a video yesterday from a gentleman out of San Francisco who said about 80%
Hmm.
of the people, and he's on the streets, with the people we're talking about and immersed in that life. And he says it's about 80% who have come from outside the San Francisco region. So we know it's not nearly as low as what HUD says, but there really is not any other qualified data other than, subjective conversations like I just
So
referenced.
it's not necessarily because the problem is bad and it just keeps kind of growing upon itself and getting worse, but there's at least some evidence that changing public policy can in fact incentivize or attract folks to come from other places, because they think they're going to get more services, or because they feel like they'll have a better go of it, I guess, as being homeless is on certain on in San Francisco versus some other place. So it's not
There,
totally out of the realm of possibility.
Absolutely. There's a plethora of anecdotal evidence, just not HUD based.
Right, right. So Michelle is the author of new research that we published at the Texas Public Policy Foundation entitled "What is Fueling the U.S. Crisis, the Homeless Crisis?" And before we get to that, before we answer that question, I think as a way of background, kind of as we jump into this research, I think it's really important for people to understand this issue of housing first. And you have consistently sounded the alarm on Housing First, which is a federal program. Can you tell us what that program does, and kind of the background on that?
Sure. So Housing First was designed back in the 90s in New York, in New York City, to get the people living on the streets, that they're often called the chronically homeless, off the streets as quickly as possible, because they were costing the system so much money, with police and fire intervention, also emergency room intervention, but they were also of harm to themselves. So the idea was, we can get them off the streets if we put them in housing where there's no conditions, where they don't have to really follow any rules, sobriety rules, engaging in counseling, rules like that. In 2008, the federal government adopted that approach. And let me step back and say that group of people constitutes somewhere between 10 and 20% of the entire homeless population. So, and I'll get back to that in a second. So, in 2008, the federal government adopted Housing First for the chronically homeless population. So, again, the idea being get them into housing as quickly as possible. They may not go into that housing if you require anything of them, if you have rules.
Right.
And again, for that population, probably made some sense, at least back then. In 2013, however, the federal government took this policy, again, approach that was designed for a very small segment and rolled it out as a one size fits all solution. So now we're giving the entire homeless population lifelong subsidized housing with no rules, no requirements, no conditions. And it has epically failed. It has failed at the federal level, where under Housing First, which again they rolled out in 2013, the unsheltered homeless population has gone up by 20.5%.
Mm.
It's failed in California, the only state that went all in on Housing First. They embedded it into state statute in 2016. And since they adopted Housing First, there was a 47.1% increase in the unsheltered population. It has epically failed, not only at the federal level, not only in California, it's failed the homeless and it's failed the communities in which they're located.
So not only has it failed, it sounds like it has actually made it worse.
It has made it worse because if you think about it, in the old system, when people entered the homeless system, there was a plethora of there was a variety of options for them. They could go into the shelter system, they could go into transitional housing. There was some permanent housing available. But with emergency shelters and with transitional, people enter in and then they exit the system. Today, however, we're giving everyone lifelong subsidized housing. There's no one exiting the system. And because you can't, build enough housing to sustain that, we've created a housing backlog. We will never be able to house everyone who is entering the system on a regular basis, who's struggling with the issues that we'll talk about here in a second, because no one is leaving.
Right. And so that's what I want to connect it to is that the not only these policies failing, but you say that that's because the policymakers have a misunderstanding about the homeless population specifically. So what don't policymakers understand?
Well, again, we'll go back to the HUD data. The HUD data says that about 20% of the homeless population are struggling with severe mental illness, about 16%, and I should say the unsheltered population, about 16% with substance use disorder. I can tell you in the program I ran for women and children, which is often considered to be the cream of the crop of the homeless, if you will, 75% of our women were struggling with addiction, 70% mental illness, another 70% domestic violence. But according to the HUD data, a very few number are struggling with these issues. In 2019, the UCLA Policy Lab and the LA Times did a deep dive into that data, the HUD data. And what they found was exactly what we found at St. John's, which is about 78% are struggling with mental illness, about 75% with substance use disorder. So we've taken a policy that we designed for a very narrow segment that showed, again, according to HUD data, that only 20% were struggling with mental illness and 16% with addiction. And we have introduced it as a one size fits all, and no wonder it's not working.
And
We are ignoring these diseases that underlie homelessness.
And that makes me think that maybe there's Well, let me throw you a little curveball here. How much do other policies like drug legalization or defunding the police departments factor into the explosion in homelessness? Because I would think, obviously, access to even weed or other drugs and things like that. But then certainly, if there's no, if the idea is we have less police out there to prevent these folks from harming themselves or others. Have you been able to look at any of those kinds of policies in other cities and seeing if they are contributing to this as well?
For the purpose of this paper, we didn't look at those specifically, and in fact, we looked at a variety of factors and said there's some that need more research. But what we did do, for the purposes of this paper, is we looked at the Wharton Residential Land Use Regulatory Index. It's a long name,
Well, that thought sounds fast.
derived from the Freedom in the 50 States report. And we found that states that have a high regulatory burden um, often have a much higher incidence uh, of not affordable, of not having affordable housing, right?
Okay.
And if you think about that in terms of the regulatory barriers, that probably translates over into other areas, which we alluded to in the paper, such as drug legalization and decriminalization.
Hmm.
But we have not done the research in a detailed way beyond looking at Wharton.
Well, having not done the research, I'm just going to stipulate that it can't help. We've got about 1 minute left. I do want to, we are a public policy organization and we're all about solutions. And so, to these problems and making real headway and progress on them. So, what do you think we can do, whether it's at the state level or at the national level, to address these root causes of homelessness and really make progress in favor of helping people?
Well, first and foremost is that we need to get rid of any one size fits all policy as it relates to the homeless population. We haven't talked numbers, but there's about pre COVID data showed there was about 1.2 million Americans struggling with homelessness in 2019. There is no one size fits all solution for them. We need to understand that what often leads them into homelessness is mental illness, drug addiction, in the case of women, domestic violence. We need to look at those underlying issues. We need to treat them. The CDC classifies these issues as diseases for a reason. These diseases need to be treated, including the trauma that many of them have faced being embroiled in homelessness. We need to recognize that we don't need to provide lifelong subsidized housing for the vast majority of the homeless population. The vast majority, with the right kind of treatment and the right kind of incentives, can become self-sustaining. They can contribute to their own housing. They don't need the government to subsidize their housing. But again, we are giving that to everyone right now, which is creating a completely unsustainable system.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the breakdown. Thank you for walking us through that. And I feel like we really learned something here. Thank you for being on the program.
Thank you, Brian.
Again, Michelle's research is what is fueling homelessness, what is fueling the U.S. crisis, and it can be found on the website texaspolicy.com. Thank you for listening.